Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast, where we are looking and exploring the Bible through the lens of the ancient world. I'm one of your hosts and the layman, Keegan Walls, with the scholar and the man himself, the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Mark Chavalas. We're excited to be back, and you'll notice right away off the bat a little bit different setup. So we're doing a little virtual one. Mark is where are you, Mark?
I am in Camarillo, California, visiting my mother, and we're not too far from the fires, but far enough away that we're not being threatened by them. So we're in good shape here.
Yeah, that was going to be my first question for the episode, which is probably not the best time to go visit California. Not a lot of people going in to Southern California.
Good time to be visiting my mom and just being here.
Yeah, awesome. So, yeah, doing it in different states, virtual, but excited to dive in. So we've kind of wrapped up. Just for those that are joining us, if you haven't already, feel free to go back to some other episodes. But we're kind of moving on from the contextual viewpoint of the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, and we're just going to start going through Genesis. So we're just going to start going through the creation account. We're going to spend some different episodes studying it. Probably just getting through Genesis 1, 2, and 3, looking at those chapters and comparing those probably afterwards to some of the other creation accounts you see. So today's episode is fully focused on Genesis 1. We'll see how much we get through in this episode. But yeah, we want to look at Genesis and what is the point and what is the writer trying to articulate through the text of Genesis. And just as a heads up, it's probably going to be much different than what you're used to. And so just kind of want to open it up to you, Mark, and talk about what is the point of Genesis, and mainly how, if people are reading it like this, it's not a science textbook. It's not going through the science of God's creation. So I'll let you open it up and turn it over to you.
Well, I think you're exactly right. It certainly isn't a science textbook. That doesn't mean that it would be contradictory to science, but that's not the point. And so I think we spend a tremendous amount of effort on that side, obviously because of our cultural context. Here we are a couple centuries past the scientific revolution. We're very interested in things like that. We want to see how our holy book matches up to the scientific realia that we have. And but then we have to realize, if the goal of the text, if that's not its goal, we are asking questions of the text that the text is not particularly interested in answering. Furthermore, if the goal of the text is something different, we have to understand what that is, and then go back and look at the framework. And so, you start off, I mean, it's sort of obvious that a creation account, the goal is to talk about beginnings. And so, in any person, whether you're a Judeo-Christian or not, you're interested, how did I get here? How did everything get here? And of course, this is an attempt. When I say attempt, I'm putting it in quotes, of course. This is our holy book. But the goal is to tell us, this is how we got here. And so it starts off, with the term "in the beginning." And so, what's the beginning? Well, that's not explained, by the way. My joke is, if a Greek would have written, let's say if it was Aristotle who wrote Genesis 1, he probably would have spent, hours and hours telling us what he thought the beginning was, and then probably months and months telling us, the nature of God and what he means by God. Well, none of that is happening here. And so is because it's not particularly interesting to the writer, or probably even the readers or the listeners, to be more precise, about necessarily the nature of God and the nature of the beginning. And I also look at Genesis 1:1, by the way, as a summary statement. Here we are: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens and the earth, by the way, is it's kind of like saying, from soup to nuts, or A to Z, or what have you. It's basically when everything started from the top to the bottom. That's like when Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. He's basically saying I'm encompassing everything from from the first letter to the end of the last letter, and of course that's also that's analogous. So here in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and so this is a summary statement. It's not a sequential text, by the way. The next sentence, by the way, is not follow the first sentence, in my opinion, any more than if I asked Keegan to write a term paper on Genesis, I would expect in his first paragraph, he would probably tell me what he was writing about, because if he didn't, I would probably send it back to him immediately and say, hey, buddy, I have no idea what you're talking about. What's your topic? Um, I don't think I can even look at this and give you a grade until I know what it is that you're writing about. And so they're giving you what the topic is. The topic is beginnings. Okay. So now the first sentence is, if you're wondering, God created the heavens and the earth. And by the way, it's actually a very controversial sentence, because I think rather than than telling you all about the ancient Near Eastern context at the end, I'm going to weave it in and out of here, because when the writer's writing this, let's call him Moses. By the way, I don't want to talk too much about authorship at this point. Maybe we can do that later on, once you've decided whether or not you want to keep on viewing this. Then I can give you some of the tougher news about authorship. But the author here, and I do believe there's a great deal of Mosaic authorship in all of this, but the author here is is writing in a particular context where everyone knows that the first sentence is just the opposite of whatever everybody else knows. And so if I go back to the Mesopotamian creation epic, and by the way, it's sort of a misnomer to call the Mesopotamian one a creation epic. The Mesopotamian story, it's called Enuma Elish, from the two first words in Akkadian, which literally means when on high. It assumes that matter is eternal. In other words, everything starts from matter, which has no consciousness. It's not aware of its own existence. It's simply there. And from this impersonal matter comes personal existence, which I don't know about you, but it seems to be a little backwards to me. And maybe it's backwards because of reading Genesis since, I was an infant. We're taught just the opposite. Personhood creates impersonal objects and other personal objects, but it's not the other way around. And so when Moses writes this, it's basically turning the entire intellectual framework of existence on its head. It's turning it upside down. So, and he's writing, think about it. The context that we are provided with is that Moses is writing to a bunch of slaves in Egypt. And if you think about Abraham, and we've talked a little bit about him in the other discussions, if you think about Abraham, he probably doesn't know a whole lot about monotheism after he's decided to follow the El Shaddai, the God of, the God. Well, I would say it's not the God of his fathers, but he's following Yahweh, Elohim. And does he know anything else about this God? Does he know it's exclusive? Does he know the nature of how the universe was started? I would say probably not. Any more than somebody from another land who decides to follow Jesus at some point, not knowing anything about Judaism and Christianity. He might be amazed to find out a little bit later on, oh, by the way, there's a whole lot more to this than meets the eye that you might want to know about coming out of your particular background, or maybe they're from Borneo or Central Iowa. That was a joke. All right, sorry. Can't help it. So, but the next sentence is really weird. Now the earth, back to Genesis. Now the earth was formless and empty. And by the way, that Hebrew phrase is sort of a funny, like a Humpty Dumpty phrase. It's like Tweedledee, Tweedledum. It's tohu mabohu. And Um, it just means empty and void. I think it's used once in the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is trying to talk about what's going to happen after Babylon destroys Israel. It's going to be like the universe looked when God made it. The rabbis looked at Genesis 1 as if God was an architect. And what do you do with an architect? You start off with your natural resources and whatever it is, and they're nothing. And so, uh, and by the way, the whole point of the Mesopotamian creation epic is to talk about the fact that there's complete and total chaos in the universe. That's its nature. And frankly, living out here in Southern California, if I was a little bit closer, I might be thinking that way. Is that the last week has been complete and total chaos here, and nature seems to be at war with us, not the other way around. And so the point of Genesis is to show that this is a God. He's exclusive and he's a God of order, and he's in complete and thorough control of everything, even the absolute beginning. So he starts off, and really, if you think about it, when it says the earth was formless and void, it's almost as if we're being given a window into God's mind and his process. Like, all right, by the way, he starts off with raw materials. Now, it might just be a millisecond, I don't know, but the point is, he's the same process that we might have, which might take a little bit longer. With God, it's momentary. I start off with lifeless, formless matter, and then from there, I'm going to create animate and inanimate objects. By the way, it's the other way around in terms of order. Um, and then it says darkness was over the surface of the deep. What on earth is going on there? You're like me. It's like I've read this 1,000 times as a little kid, but I couldn't tell you what it means. What's the deep? Uh, the word there in Hebrew, tahom, it just means the waters or the sea. Um, but in Mesopotamia, the same root is talking about a real personal being, which sort of comes out of the watery mass. Uh, the waters are there from the beginning, the primordial sea, and evidently they become animate, male and female. The female is called Tiamat, and she becomes the mother of all creation, if you want to use that word. And so it's very possible that the writer of Genesis is aware of that and not necessarily speaking against it, but is making sure that you understand that we're being given the correct way to interpret the nature of existence and our origins. And so he uses this phrase uh, that seems to be really random and out of place. And then it talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. Uh, the word there for waters is another one. By the way, the Bible likes to use, though Genesis 1 is a narrative, it's a poetic narrative. It has lots and lots of alliteration. It has puns. It's something that you're supposed to listen to. And so when you hear that repetition and you hear something that's slightly different in the repetition throughout the days, you're supposed to be alerted to it, but it's also a helper, sort of like a memory device for you when you're listening. You say, oh, that's something a little different. Um, so, so whatever it means, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. And if you're wondering, by the way, does God create everything out of nothing? Well, if you simply had Genesis 1, 1, and 2, you wouldn't know, in my opinion. In other words, I think it's implied there that God is creating everything out of nothing, but the goal here is to show that God is in complete control of matter and creation and everything in it. And it's not necessarily answering the question that you and I might have, and that's like, how did everything actually get here? Did God create everything out of nothing? Well, actually, later on in the book of Isaiah, there's one little anecdotal note about the fact that God created everything out of nothing. And I think in the book of, I don't know if it's first or second Maccabees now, I should have looked it up, but it talks about the fact that God created everything out of nothing. And so that's sort of an educated effort by later Jewish tradition to understand this. Uh, there's no reason to think, of course, that matter is coexistent with God. The whole point of this is that God manipulates matter for his own devices. Whether it was there or not before is probably immaterial. That's a bad pun to the writer, but if you follow the logic, then you would come to the conclusion that God created everything out of nothing, ex nihilo in the Latin. But it's not it's not explicit in here, and I would defy anybody to show me where it's explicit.
Yeah, let's pause.
Then you
Let's pause there. Let's stop with
Yes.
the 1 and 2, because then I have questions on that. So, mainly, so that opening sentence, I don't know if what your thoughts on that are. So the way that we read it, which I think the way that verse 1 is read, is the biggest reason why people assume that it is teaching ex nihilo. God created everything out of nothing. But to you, is that language, like, should it be an independent clause like it is right there? Like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Because I've also heard other claims, like the Jewish Publication Society. They say that translation's a little bit different, where it should be read more like when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and void, and at least if you're thinking through it, in my mind, that was kind of the first moment where I went, okay, well, if it's in the beginning, God created this, and then not right, because it's almost like it follows it. Like you're saying, it doesn't follow it. So if I see that independent clause, God created this, now this, it's just like taking me down this bunny trail of thought. But if it is more a preparatory introduction, but it's also, let's say it's written a little bit different, and the language should be when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Now a little subnote, well, now when he began to create it, the earth was formless and void. That at least should, in my mind, go, okay, wait, so when he began creating the earth was, and again, wrong question, but at least that, to me, in my mind, that gets my brain to think. Again, I cannot bring the wrong questions to the text, but in my mind, I'm going, well, yeah, it's not trying to teach me the science, the postmodern thinking of, he's trying to teach me science, and this is exactly how God built the house and the foundation, and it's a builder's manual. It at least makes me think and ask the question, wait, the earth already was? Again, I think a bad question, but then I go, okay, well, maybe it's not trying to explain that at all. That was the first kind of light bulb moment for me. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, because, well, first of all, it's not a wrong question. It's a wrong question if you expect that you're going to get an answer. Uh, you can go ahead and ask the questions. That's how I look at it. And now I remember, I think I've said this in the other ones. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I'm a Babylonian scholar, and so I look at this from the outside, and so I'm not an expert on the intricacies of biblical Hebrew grammar. However, I have read up enough to know that both are possible. In other words, this could be a subordinate clause at the beginning, and so the main point is the fact that God um, is that matter was basically unprepared, and the point is not. In other words, the creating part is secondary, and the main point of the sentence is that that it's there and it's ready-made. It's like ready-made clay. It's just sitting there like, like you and we're a lump of clay until Genesis 2, when God decides to do something with the clay. So, but both are possible, and since both are possible, then you have to be really humble, I suppose, about your dogmatic statements about it, realizing it could be one or it could be the other. And of course, the evangelical church traditionally has certainly taken it at Genesis 1:1 as a independent statement that is the beginning of it. And my answer is that's certainly possible, but I don't think it, it doesn't convince me. That's for sure. Does this ultimately make any difference? No. The point of the matter is that Moses is showing that our God, the God of Israel, is in absolute and complete control of the entirety of all that exists, and he has there's no other authority that is contesting it. He did everything on his own by himself, with his own cognizance, and that's completely unlike any of the other creation traditions. Mesopotamia, by the way, has multiple creation traditions. The Enuma Elish, is by far the biggest one and the most famous because it's the most complete, and it was one of the earliest ones found. Um, and it shows, and it explains, I think, in many respects, why creation and matter they're dangerous to us, and you could be wiped off the map. And of course, this the same thing can happen to an Israelite, but they haven't answered that there's a divine being behind this who's in complete control. um, and of course that almost makes it worse until you realize that the divine being who's in complete control is also good. And so if he is good, then ultimately you're going to be cared for, even if, uh, at this moment there's, it's terrible.
Hmm.
And of course there's a reason for that. And that's 2 chapters later.
Yeah. So then my follow-up question to that would be, so going to verse 2, how are we supposed to, I know you did it a little bit and explained it, but how are we supposed to take that word chaos, now the earth was empty and void, right? Because if I'm reading that, I'm going, okay, like, so is it chaos as in terms of like the
No,
connotation that I would pull from chaos, right? Everything's
no,
nuts. Or
no,
how would you define it?
it would be nothingness. It's just nothing. It's it would be as if it was just it would be as if it's just a big rock. There's nothing to it. Formless and void. Like I said, tohu mabohu, it's a funny phrase, which is probably just a euphemism for, you know, I I don't know, what would we say in English? I think of 2 words that are always go together, and they ultimately, have little or no meaning to them except in the context. I don't know. I'll have to think about it and come back to it. But, um, it's just there. I think sometimes we get too caught up in doing a deep dive in the words rather than trying to figure out how the words, what they mean together. Uh, and that's what's going on here. Um, it is just talking about I mean, the generic meaning behind it is I think rather apparent. We uh, God's got all his building materials, and they're not being used yet. They're just sitting there. You know,
Yep.
think about it. You got all the materials for a house, and they're just sitting there, but they're lifeless. They're useless to you until somebody comes by with a brain, and can tell you how to put it all together. Okay. That's me. I have no, you give me, a box, of Legos to put together. I'm going to look at it and say, that's nothing. And it's going to stay nothing until somebody else comes by and does it for me, because I can't do it. Um, and then it becomes this beautiful creation. You're thinking that's really cool. Well, think about it. You put it on slightly bigger terms, and that's what God is doing here. And so the emphasis is on the fact that God is taking this lifeless, formless matter and doing something with it. But our question is, wait a minute, where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And the writer is thinking, well, I don't even have to answer that one. I I don't think that's being answered here, but I think that it's implied if you think about it. If God is the complete, and think about it. What's the Hebrew, um, thing that they forbid. You can never make a representation of God. Why? Because then he becomes subordinate to uh, his own creation. So they're rabidly against it, uh, because he's not part of matter. He transcends it. Well, if he transcends matter, then of course he had to create it himself. I mean, that's the conclusion, but they're not thinking that way. They don't need to think that way. It's us stained with our Greco-Roman heritage that, we got infected with having to think this way. Well, not terribly wrong necessarily, but so I think that's what the issue is.
Yeah. So then
And
what?
there's the Spirit of God that showing that God's not a part of this. He's above it. He's above all of this stuff. Yeah, I would say physically, if I want to use that word, or conceptually also. He's not a part of it.
Okay. So in your mind, go with the Enuma Elish kind of example there of the creation goddess or whatever coming out of the deep. That's your field. So I'll let you expound on that. Like, do you see some like theological messaging? Because some people would say it in a way, like it's still giving this overall picture, but throughout you kind of see this like theological messaging or uh at that time, because it's Old Testament, Jewish apologetics almost to what their worldview would have been.
Well, um, I I I think that's a hard one to answer because then it would force me to try and figure out, all right, exactly when is this being written, or when is the final edition being written, and who are they addressing? Because let's say Genesis through 2 Kings is finally put down in its edited form at the end of 2 Kings. That would be nearly 1,000 years after Moses. And there are hints here and there, of course, that of editorial statements in Genesis to show that the final edition is written later on. That doesn't mean that Moses doesn't play a significant role in all this. I think he plays an overwhelmingly significant role. But um, like any writer, you're going to be writing to your own context. I mean, think about it. If you decided to write a book and you only wanted to be read by people in 1,000 years, well, guess what? It won't make it because somebody now would have to think of it being worthy for somebody to be reading, and and so they're writing to their own context. The problem is I don't know exactly when that is. And so it might be the Babylonian captivity. In that respect, they might be answering directly to the Enum Elish, which was something that an exiled Jew would see once a year being recited at the New Year's festival when they would bring out the statue of Marduk. And by the way, the Enuma Elish is not the goal of the Enuma Elish is not to tell you how everything came into existence, is to tell you how Marduk was the supreme god of everything. And if you reverse it, then Genesis is answering the same type of question. Who's supreme over all of creation, all of matter? It's the God of Israel. That's who is. And so it's not answering the question, how do we all get here? And the other question is, and in what order did he do all this stuff? And how can I apply it to modern science? Uh, my answer is good luck.
Mm. So so like it's not necessarily answering um from a materialistic standpoint of the matter. It's not answering how those things got here. It's more focused on the substance, the function of it more than the actual development.
That's my guess. That's the best shot for me.
Yeah. Then that would make sense because even as I studied it, I think one of the as a simple guy, one of the analogies that made sense in my mind was the difference between like building a home. Like it's not giving you a outline or a manual of how to actually build the home. First you start with the foundation, and then you put this here, and then you put the floor in. It's more of like an empty home. There's no form or reason to it yet, but you want to fill it with you want to get married, have a spouse, fill it with kids. Here's what we're going to do with that room. It's going to serve for this function. We're going to have gatherings over here. At least in my mind, that's kind of how it makes sense to me.
Yes,
The
but
difference between the two.
but think about it. How about if you're telling me all that, and my first question is, wait a minute, where did you get the wood? Oh, I got it from the trees. And then my next question is, well, where did the trees come from? And you're probably going to be a little exasperated, like, wait a minute,
That's the point.
that's not our point here. Our point is that we want to talk about the end result and how the architect is really, really smart and orderly, and what a great architect he is.
Yeah. And so before we go, because I'll let you go further into Genesis, the actual creation days, bring us into the Mesopotamian or the ancient context. Like, what in their mind are they thinking? Because now what I need to do, and what we hope our listeners are doing, like, I need to get rid of this. Like, okay, I got to get rid of wanting to make it say the questions I have. I have questions, and so I want it to be answering questions I have instead of reading it of, okay, what is it trying to answer? And so we think, again, it's the same thing we've been talking about. We want to know how to get here. We want to know the science questions. So to them, what is their supreme thought or ideology of how they would have understood this?
So you mean for Mesopotamia?
Yeah, like essentially, like,
Well,
what's the question they're trying to like when they talk creation, what is their like highest order, right? Ours is kind of actual scientific evidence. We want like beginning,
yeah.
order, create, whatever. But in their mind, they have a different standard. They're like that science postmodern thought process is not coming into they're not even thinking about that. They're not entertaining it. So what is it for them?
Well, for them, it's, I mean, they obviously can look and see matter. Maybe even they're probably even more aware of it than we are, since they're not living, with lights in big cities. They're, and I remember living in the middle of the Syrian desert. It was like, wow, I'm a much more aware of my surroundings. When it gets a little windy, it's like, wow, I'm intimately, aware that it's really very windy now, or we would have a sandstorm or whatever. And so I think they're really more attuned to that. But for them, of course, they're trying to put this in their own context. And of course, Genesis ultimately is trying to show how we're how we fit into all this, because that's the whole point. Like, where do I come from? Why am I here? Why, why am I living such a difficult, dreary life? And of course, um, what the Mesopotamians do in their creation epics, and I can just sort of generically summarize them, is they're taking inanimate matter, and it be for whatever reason, when certain parts of matter intermingle, uh it's not necessarily fresh and salt waters, it's just waters. And when they mingle together, they create some sort of consciousness. Now, don't ask me how that works. In fact, they're probably not particularly concerned about that either. But at that point, these are, I suppose you can call them proto gods. And I sort of joke, it's kind of like Transformers, where you've got the original, what is it, some box or whatever.
Yep.
And and then from there, stems later on the personality of these, these creatures. Um, and there's good guys and bad guys, and here's the same thing going on. This is actually, if you read Greek mythology and the story about the Titans and the later gods at war with each other, this is actually, in many respects, an earlier version of that. It's remarkable how close it is. It's actually closer to Greek and Roman mythology than it in their creation stories than it is to Genesis, in my opinion. And um, so the two first, I don't know what you want to call them, proto deities. It's Absu and Tiamat. And by the way, Absu, this Sumerian name ultimately comes all the way into English, and it's the word abyss. And Tiamat, again, it's personhood, and they began procreating. Don't ask me how that works. I have no idea, and there's no discussion about it. But they will now generate, uh, I suppose you can call proto gods. And at some point, the younger generations will bug the older generations through noise and other things. And so there's actually war between the generational deities, and the male origin, Apsu, is killed through all of this by one of the younger deities, Ea. And that's when Tiamat now goes ballistic. The mother of all existence is now going to go on a rampage and try to destroy the generations that follow her, that are against her. And so there's now full war. And I don't know if you want to call it heaven yet, because it doesn't explain the three-part universe yet, which would be the heavens, the earth, and then the under the earth, which would be the sea, by the way, and even death in many respects. And so, so the younger gods have to choose a champion who will go and fight big mean Tiamat, and they of course choose Marduk, the god of Babylon, which was not known yet. And by the way, the head of the Mesopotamian pantheon, Enlil, is suspiciously absent from this text because he was probably the original champion, and his name got pulled out and Marduk got replaced. In an Assyrian text, Ashur is named as the champion of the gods. And so Marduk comes out. And by the way, he's chosen by the younger gods while they're in assembly and they've been drinking heavily. And so when they're intoxicated, toasty, drunk, then they choose Marduk. And Marduk pretty much says, if you want me as your king, yeah, I'm taking all of you. I'm the supreme king and commander. And they accept it. He goes and he kills Tiamat, and from her carcass, he creates what we would consider to be the material universe. So we're sort of hanging out on Tiamat's corpse right now, sort of icky to think. A little bit later, the gods, and by the way, these are sort of teleologies. These are ways to explain the current situation. The current situation really stinks. I'm a lower class person. I work really hard. And within a generation or two, I'm dead, and maybe I'm dead of starvation. Well, how does that work? It's because the gods have to do all the dirty work to create forms for their own existence, houses. They have to dredge canals. They have to get food and drink because it's needed for them. They're part of matter, so they need it. And they complain to Marduk, and Marduk says, all right, I'll make a slave group that will do this for you. And it happens to be humanity. So now we know why we're here. Okay. We're here to be slaves to the gods. And so, in fact, there's no word for religion in any of the Mesopotamian sources. It probably would be servitude or hard labor or something, because that's all we do. And it's basically for the temple, or at least for the gods. And so what do? So I either help build a temple or dredge canals, or I'm paying taxes so you can do it. And then I die. And so it's a pretty tough existence because of that. And through no fault of my own, by the way, and frankly, we're here to serve the gods. The gods are not here to serve us or to help us. And so when I want, let's say if you're a god and I want to pray to you, I have to sort of make a deal with you. Otherwise, it's got to be a give and take. In other words, what can I offer you? Well, I promise to go to your temple and worship you. I promise to give you some more gold coins if you heal my sick child, or I do this or do that. And so, it's a way to explain that. But the point of the Babylonian creation epic is not to talk about how things came into being. It's how Marduk became the supreme god, and why you as a human being are just an afterthought. But if you think about it in Genesis, part of the question seems to be answered. How do we get here? Well, first of all, our God is the supreme God who has no other rival. And so he's doing this entirely on his own for his own purpose. And oh, by the way, we have a much better situation in this environment. If you want self-esteem, be a Hebrew human in the Hebrew context, because God gives you a much higher calling. The anthropology, I suppose you could say, in Israel is much higher than it is in the rest of the ancient Near East.
Yeah. Yeah, so that would be one of the first big differences, would be God also being above and outside matter as opposed to
Yes.
none. And a little bit, which you don't really get it in Genesis, but we do serve God, but it sounds like from the other creation, like they need us to do
Well,
these things as
yes. Well, think about it. When David tells God he wants to build him a house, it's almost as if God gets angry, because he writes back, and I mean he answers David back almost sarcastically. Do you think I'm paraphrasing? What do you think I need a house? Do you actually think I need a house? Where would I live? What would anything encompass me? And so it's a rhetorical statement. Well, of course I don't need any of these things. And he allows Solomon to build it, but it's primarily built so we can come and serve the king of the universe, because he's a king and he's got his own court and he's got his own council, and we get to come and pay homage to him.
yeah.
Now, in Mesopotamia, just to show you that if you took all of the gods together, they would not be the sum total of the power of the universe. They understood that. And so each god is a lot more powerful than you and I are. And so they are to be worshiped, or at least, feared because of that. But there's something higher than them. And so, for example, the god Enki, the best Akkadian Ea, he wears a sorcerer's hat because he's trying to manipulate the operative forces of the universe, because they're sort of above his own power ranking. And so there's something above the gods called destiny or fate, and they're written on tablets. And the goal of the gods is to basically run the universe according to the fates, which are all impersonal. And so their goal is to be the arbiters of it. Uh, and when they go against it or whatever, or if the tablets are taken away, then it's like we lost our manual. We don't know what to do. In the Anzu story in Mesopotamia, a divine bird steals the tablets in the universe. Basically, it's a government shutdown until they kill the bird and get the tablets back. And so if you're wondering who really controls uh, the universe, for them, it's impersonal fate, whatever that is, because it has no personhood to it. Nobody ever worships fate. There's no statue to fate. In Greece, there ultimately is the female goddess Tyche or Fortuna in Rome. But even then, those are just minor deities there. They've sort of long lost that understanding. But here, it's it's subtle. Well, in Israel, I would imagine in Israel, I would say, "Hey, I think I know what your fate is. It's actually a personhood. It's God. It's Elohim." And so it's a complete reversal of understanding. And so point A in Israel, uh, an im, a non-corporal being, but sentient, creates the material universe and is in complete control over it and manipulates it for his own goals and desires, which are ultimately good. In Mesopotamia, we have impersonal matter, which seems to want to get to order, but it doesn't know it. But it has no consciousness. And from that comes uh, the heavenly beings, which are very, very powerful. But again, they're very they're powerful, but they don't control the ultimate existence.
Hmm.
They try to, in fact, even when the flood comes, the gods themselves were afraid that they had overreached themselves.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I guess my follow-up question, everything that you said, super super interesting. Now my mind goes critically to what people might be thinking or questions they're asking. And
Yes.
for you to look at it in this new way, setting up Genesis, for you in your mind, what would you say or how would you argue that just because we're saying it's not talking about the actual like creation, how we think creation, but it's talking about order and function. Some people would argue like that takes away from like almost that it takes away from it being divinely inspired or like the inerrancy or infallibility. You kind of hear that I at least in the evangelical world, you kind of hear that argument like, well, I've always known it and understood it like this, and then it's almost this like presupposed idea that well, no, that's just always what church has thought too. And so for you to do this, it almost well, if it's not talking about actual creation, like you're taking away from God's sovereignty and the fact that the word of God is the word of God and divinely inspired, which is not
I
what you're doing.
suppose I suppose tongue in cheek, I would say something like, "And you know exactly what divinely inspired means and how God in God's word is supposed to be interpreted." And my answer is you might wanna open your mind up a little bit to see that there are, uh, not so much that there's different ways of interpreting it, is that every piece of text is is a piece of literature. It has its own context, and so as a historian, this is how I'm trained to think, is that I'm going to, you know, I'm looking at a text, I'm saying, "All right, who is when was this written? Where was it written? Who was it written, by? Who was it written for? What type of literature is this?" Etcetera. If I don't ask all of those questions, if I equalize everything, which I think is what happened. I was talking with somebody earlier today, um, about this, and one of the questions is when you're taking certain particular texts in the Bible, um, they are all of equal value, but they're not all of equal meaning, and so you can't take a narrative and compare it to, a portion of the Song of Songs, for example. They have completely different meanings, and so maybe you should take a literature course first, and I'm being a little facetious, but you wanna learn, all right, okay, this is poetry, this is not poetry. Um, what what is the I wanna know what the writer is thinking. What is their goal here? If their goal is if their goal is pre-scientific, then their work is pre-scientific, and they're not answering the questions that I have. And so I think the evangelical world has been they I mean, I think it's right to take the Bible literally when it should be taken literally. It's all the word of God. And so, and so it all has power to it. There's another phrase I want to use here, which I might have to explain if I tell you, but it's called cosmic geography. What's going on here? Is this a heavenly understanding of things? When you look at Ezekiel's temple, by the way, in Ezekiel 40 through 48, like that where's that this is Ezekiel's vision. Is this a vision of the future temple that we're supposed to build, or is this um a heavenly version? And it's so unbelievable that this is the best way to explain it. I mean, really, if you think about it, here we are trying to understand the concept of God's order. Is his order here, is it sequential or is it thematic? That's another issue. And once you ask that question about the days, uh, then a lot of things are now on the table. Um, you know, um, does it tell me it's now, billions of years rather than thousands? My answer is I don't know. I'm not qualified to make that statement. I'm not even sure a scientist is in many respects. But scientists deal with realia, and I can't argue with what they find. I don't have the tools to argue. Uh, uh, but I have a different set of tools, and so I'm using my tools to try to understand the best way I can. but I'm not dogmatic about it. And so I'm asking other listeners, try not to be dogmatic about your powers of interpretation, because the way you're interpreting the text might not be the only way to interpret it.
Mm, yeah. No, yeah,
There
I find that good and interesting. I think maybe then the follow pushback, or at least trying to get into some people's minds, would then be like, again, okay, you seem to put so much emphasis on the context and the characters and the readers. Well, they don't know science, but God does, because God's God. And so
Yeah,
then I think it's a misunderstanding of divinely inspired. And so
yes.
maybe to even close us out, you can talk about that, because again, it's I think sometimes when we talk about infallibility, inerrancy, and just ultimately, I think what most people mean by that is just it's God wrote the Bible, like it's God's words through man. It's divinely inspired by God. But I think most of the time we don't ever like take it further than the phrase, and so it's almost like this assumption that like it's the actual, like God, like the person actually writing it, their brain is turned off, they're on autopilot, and God just goes. But it's like we understand that God inspires, and God still speaks through the Bible today. But even what we're going to see later in the Bible and what we see in the New Testament is God is so good and so sovereign. In my mind, it actually heightens his sovereignty, that it's not in that way, that he is speaking it and he is inspiring it, but it's not in this auto control way, and still is to a context and to a people and how they would have understood it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because I think that, I mean, God could use that autopilot form, and maybe he does with some prophets, but there seems to be a tremendous variety. Well, think of just reading the Bible itself. Even though you might find a common theme, the differences in the text, the types of literature, the personalities are so fundamentally different that you have to realize that there's a lot of different human authors, and even to come to the conclusion that there's one divine author behind it is pretty subtle. You have to, in a sense, you're sort of trained to think that way. Um, and we think of this divine inspiration. We like to use negative terms. The Bible is not fallible. The Bible is not errant. And of course, the Bible never informs its us of itself in that matter. It does inform us of the fact of the positive elements. It's the power of God. That's Romans 1:16 and 17. And so it's not so much that I think the fear the evangelical has, and it's an understandable one. And when I say that, I'm part of this, is that when you read Genesis 1, what happens if it doesn't match up with our scientific realia? Does that mean the Bible is in error? And my answer is, I suppose it might be, if the goal of the text was to explain all of the scientific principles as to how God did all this. And that's not even possible. I mean, of course, it's possible God can do anything, but if he's writing to a real audience in a real context, he's writing to them. And remember, from the very beginning, I've said the Bible is written, you know, for us, but it wasn't written directly to us. It was written to another audience with very different thinking patterns. And so we have to try to reconstruct that. It doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect in it. It just means that we're going to appreciate that more, and perhaps have more insight into why the text reads the way it does. I mean, look at Genesis 15 and the weird covenant that God makes with Abraham, with all these birds and God's hovering in between the divided carcass. You're thinking, well, that's sort of weird. Um, but somebody living in Amorite Mesopotamia during the time of Abraham would say, yeah, I get that. I know exactly what's going on, but it's really, really weird. Um, And we didn't even understand that until recently. Even then, it's still hard to follow. So I guess what I'm trying to do is opening up our minds to try to, it's not like you're wrong and I'm right. You guys have completely misunderstood this. No, here's another way to try to understand this. Remember, I'm a historian. I'm not saying that the way I do this is the only way to understand the text. What I'm saying is I'm trying to use all the facilities at my disposal, which are history. I'm just beginning to work with literature. I've in the past decade or so, I've tried to understand, all right, what form of literature this is. The problem with Genesis, and when I say problem, it's because it's written like a regular narrative, and we take regular narratives like, all right, these are facts. Here's fact number one, fact number two, fact number three, etc. And they build upon each other. And the ancient mind just doesn't, they don't look at existence in the same way that we do. So I want to try to understand how they're figuring all this out. Um, and so, and it's intimidating, and it means, because of course I know that most people I talk to, they want all of the theological ducks in a row and they want them to stay there. So it means that whatever question you have for me, I should be able to give you a good, solid theological answer to explain why A happens or B happens or whatever. But then, of course, what happens when, unspeakable tragedy happens to you. And I sit there and tell you, oh, well, this happened because God, blah, blah, blah. And you're probably thinking, that's not the answer that makes me feel good right now. I need comfort because of this tragedy that just happened to my family or whatever. Um, and so it's, I think I want people to be comfortable with the fact that all of their theological ducks might not stay in a row,
Mhm.
uh, and that they can trust God, but they can't necessarily trust their powers of interpretation. So when I'm done with this, I go to God and say, "This is the best I could do today. How was that?" And then tomorrow I might say, "Boy, that was a really dumb way of looking at things. I didn't realize that. Thank you for doing that." I'm interacting with a fellow in Florida who's really humble. He's been studying the ancient Near East, and he said, one of the first things I learned is, I don't understand this. If this is wrong, God, take this from me. And he just kept on studying. And he said, I think I've been teaching my church something wrong. I need to relearn this so I can teach it to them right. And I said, don't be too hard on yourself. It's sort of like the human condition. Uh, and frankly, if I'm not teaching differently than I was 40 years ago, there'd be something wrong with me.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't learn anything at 40 years about how to do this, and so even what I'm telling you now, I'm hoping it would be even a little different than a year or 2 or a year ago or 2 years ago. I'm just learning and learning, and what I trust in is not my ability to understanding, it's God.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that. And I appreciate you correcting me, because when I was talking about the divinely inspired, yes, there are multiple. Jesus is the word made flesh. There are times where audible voice of God, thus says the Lord, the prophets, yes.
Right.
I was meaning it in this narrative form, but then I was having a similar conversation with somebody yesterday, similar to what you were just talking about, of like, yeah, it might change in a couple years. Again, I work simply, so I come up with maybe bad analogies, but to explain what's going on in my chaotic ADD mind. But I look at it like this: let's say there's like 1,000 books on this topic, right? Then
Yeah.
I think humility is saying, look, I've read 10 of them. Through reading 10 of them, here's what I think. Here's what I know. But I also can't know what I don't know. There's
Yep.
all this depth and all this material to it. I haven't read everything. I don't know everything. We have to just admit we don't know everything. And so let's say, just for simple terms and simple numbers, there's 1,000 books on it. Well, here's where I'm at through reading 10 of them. Look, now I
Yeah,
might read 50 and 60 and I might learn something new.
and when you read number 61, it might undo everything you've
Yeah.
learned. And
Yeah.
so I guess my answer is, this is my best shot, and I'm open to suggestions, criticisms, and and learning new things, which hopefully would modify it if it basically unearths it like with a steam shovel, then shame on me if that works. You
Yeah.
know,
That's kind of the point of this is even in just studying it and looking at it this way, what I've learned is now even going to new through sitting down and meeting and learning from you is I'm going to these other texts and it's not so much, oh wow, look what I know now. It's no, I'm just starting to see more of this, see similar things so that it's more of like I know the right questions to ask. Not like
yeah.
right questions like that. I just know different questions to ask, and so now I'm coming to text with different questions, and now I joke with my wife, like, "I can't even read the Bible anymore." Now all of a sudden, it's like I read half of a sentence, and I go, "Oh, I think I think I've been missing that, and I think there's something to it." I could study that, like, little back half of a sentence for, like, seemingly months and years and years and years. So,
As long as you still read the rest of it like a 4-year-old, you're fine.
yeah.
What I'm saying is you read it, you read, Jesus loves me, this I know for the Bible tells me so, and I'm thinking that hasn't changed since I was 4.
Yeah.
Uh, and now everything else is in that context. And so now I can go into the weeds and evaluate if, part B of a verse for 4 months, realizing that I can't stay there because, of course, then I forgot the whole purpose of this was to know and understand God, not to tickle my intellectual fancy, which, by the way, is fine as long as I do it for the right reason.
Yeah. No. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, keeping everything consistent with it's ultimately to know Jesus. I wanna know him
Yeah.
better. And
Yes.
and in that same vein of, man, I start to the more I learn, I come to a text, and I maybe have said it on other episodes. I come to the text with a question, and now instead of again understanding, I understand a little bit, might not be totally right, but it's more of like I come and I want an answer to my question, and now I leave the text and I go, I know far less than I thought I knew, and now I have 20 questions. And then
Yep.
I know that's frustrating, which is why we have the theological boxes. But again, like if you could go with, let's say you don't have kids, you're not married, and for 10 years straight, 50 years straight, 100 years straight, just study the Bible and figure it out. That doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't come with the title God. It's the
Yeah.
word of God. If I could spend any length of uninterrupted time and come to the end of it, it doesn't like that's what like when people are like I have to know it, it doesn't make sense. He stops being God then.
Yeah.
Like
You'll never get
what a bummer. I'm gonna spend all like you've always said, I'm gonna spend all of eternity understand like having revelation and knowing him better. How could I think I could possibly understand this all now? And I find it more beautiful that it's like the more I study it, the less I know, and more the depth and the richness and the beauty of who Jesus is, which is ultimately why we study the word.
unsearchable, unfathomable, and so we never get there. I like unanswered questions. My mentality is, oh, good, there's more things to play with, to fiddle around with. Others I know don't like it, and so they have to, I suppose, get out of that mentality, realizing that certainty is God's domain, not mine.
Mm, that's good.
Yeah, cool.
Well, fun. Yeah, we'll end it there, and we'll pick up next episode looking at the actual days of creation. So this was a fun topic.
Good.
Super awesome. Again, to everybody tuning in, we appreciate you guys following along with us. And if you have questions, reach out. We'll probably at the end of this Genesis creation chunk probably have an episode or two just on Q&As. So feel
Yeah,
free. We want to interact. We want to know what you guys are thinking, what your thoughts, your questions are. And thank you, Mark, for your time.
my pleasure.
All right. See you all next time.
Great.